Hello, I'm Craig Johnson, and I'd like to talk today a little bit about theater in the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. This is really a personal reflection, largely a history of the past 200 years of theater in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, taking us up to the present day, and then talking a little bit about how theater happens nowadays, and looking just a bit at what the future might hold for theater in this area. So even though I'm talking about Minneapolis and St. Paul and the greater metropolitan area here, it stands as a really rich example of the kind of theatrical activity, how it's changed and how it's developed over the years, not only in these cities, but across the state of Minnesota, throughout the United States, and a little bit on sort of the global impact of theater over the last 200 years. Just a little bit. Yeah, not a hard thing to do. Here we go. First of all, just a little bit about me. I was born and raised in St. Paul with a few years spent overseas. Ever since my triumphant debut in Green Eggs and Ham in 6th grade, I've always been doing the plays. And that continued on up through high school and into college and university at the University of Minnesota, where I majored in theater. And then I realized, wow, I really need to have something marketable skill to fall back on. So I also got an English degree. What was I thinking? Actually, it turned out really well because I worked in an associated field in the humanities for the Minnesota Historical Society for over 38 years. And for the largest part of that time, I was the manager of the James J. Hill House, a huge Victorian mansion in St. Paul, where I was able to use both my English and my theater degrees in large part. I've done some teaching at the college level, some writing, some producing, but most people know me as an actor and a director for over 40 years on various Twin City theater stages. Now, since I'm talking about the last 200 years, I do just want to start off and acknowledge that the area that we know as Minnesota for thousands and thousands of years was occupied by indigenous people, and before contact with white Europeans, it was sort of divided almost 50-50 between the Ojibwe and the Dakota nations. But we do know that amongst those people, as well as from people all across the globe, that human beings forever have always told their story through art. And they've left that from the earliest documented evidence that we have of any human culture through cave paintings and through petroglyphs. And even here in Minnesota, in the southwestern part of the state, there's a place called Jeffers Petroglyphs, where there are hundreds of stone carvings dating back to several thousand years BCE that tell us a little bit about what those people thought of the world, of themselves, and their place in it. You see an image of the thunderbird, which could be a bird itself, or it could possibly be someone who's dressed up as the bird character, perhaps for a ritual or a ceremony of some kind. And we see parallel examples of that in cave paintings throughout the world, where we might have humans who are wearing animal skins, or they may be dancing, they may be playing musical instruments. So the performing arts linked with cultural and possibly religious rituals and ceremonies goes back thousands of years and all around the globe. Here in what became eventually Minnesota, there was a fellow named Seth Eastman who was a officer at Fort Snelling in the middle part of the 19th century. And one of the wonderful things that he did was to go around and document the Dakota culture, their dwellings, their people, their activities. And here you see an image of the dog dance of the Dakota right there. And we acknowledge then that this is a very rich and deep culture, again, filled with performing arts, with storytelling, with music, dance, and costumes. But since Seth Eastman was an officer at Fort Snelling, that seems like it might be a good place for us to start. Fort Snelling was the outpost of the US government that was established around 1820 on the bluff overlooking the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers, right in between what is now Minneapolis and St. Paul. And during those years, the fort was never involved in any battle, So just simply getting through the long winters was itself something of a trial and a bit of a battle, if you will. And so one of the things that the soldiers did was to put on plays for one another. And there are accounts dating back to the 1820s, and in the 1830s, they talk about, they did a play every fortnight. So every other week, there was a new show that went up. Can you imagine? They were doing a full season right there. Very ambitious, those boys. The pictures that you see right here obviously are not photographs from the 1820s and 1830s. They're pictures of me in my first job, which is working as a historic interpreter for the Minnesota Historical Society at historic Fort Snelling. And that's what I did when I was a teenager and during high school, and then a little bit later in college. But another fellow about my same age was there in the 1840s. And we should pause on him for just a moment. Here he was stationed at historic Fort Snelling. He was actually a musician, I think, in the fife and drum corps. And as a young man, he participated in a lot of these amateur theatricals that were going on at Fort Snelling. He played, since he was a younger boy, a little bit like Shakespeare's company of players. He played a lot of the female roles. He remembers things like Desdemona in Othello and things like that. When he left the army in 1845, he then made a decision. He was going to become a professional actor. And he did that for the remainder of his life. And he was a successful actor. He always kept working. He was sometimes a manager. Sometimes he wrote plays, a lot of times the short little farces that might follow in a main bill of fare for an evening at the theater. So writing himself a really good part, helping to get himself into a company perhaps. And fortunately for us, he was also a diarist. So for 15 years, from 1845 to 1860, he kept a regular diary of his life as an actor. And it's one of the best examples, firsthand examples that we have of what a career in the theater looked like in the mid-19th century. Other than a few other stars, his is the most complete account that we have. And not surprisingly, all of the diaries are up online, so you can go just Google him and find out more about Harry Watkins. But here are just a couple examples to give you a taste of it. Yes, Harry Watkins is tweeting. Here's one from that time period where he rehearsed one show in the morning. In the afternoon, he was busy learning his lines. And then in the evening, he went off and performed in another play. And that would be a pretty typical day for a working actor at that time period. Of course, there are always emergencies that kind of erupted, and he had to learn Prince Hal and Henry IV in one day. It took him 9 hours, and he felt that he was letter perfect and went on the following night. Economic issues for freelance actors, always an issue then and now. And one of the things that he kept battling his producers and his managers for was to finally get up to $15 per week, one of the great events of my life, he wrote. Well, if we toggle back then and now think about St. Paul in the 1850s, this is a time when Minnesota had become a territory, and at the end of that decade, a state, and that was on the eve of the Civil War. And at that time period, St. Paul was a bustling riverfront town right at the head of the navigable waters of the Mississippi River. If you went any further up to Minneapolis, then you ran into St. Anthony Falls right there. And in downtown St. Paul, there were a couple little buildings like this one, which was called Market House. And Market House, up on its second floor, had a very large open room with benches facing a small stage and a curtain. And that is where some of the earliest theatrical activity took place in the Twin Cities area. Usually these were amateur performers on a variety bill of different kinds of acts, things that were happening. And during the summer months on the riverboats, up might come a traveling troupe, possibly doing like a nightly turnover in repertory. If there was something that people really liked, they'd do it a couple more days, they would bring it back once again, and then they would head back away by the time the fall came, before the river froze up. And a lot of those were more the traveling players, sort of mom and pop kind of outfits. If you think of Charles Dickens' Nicholas Nickleby, it would probably have a little bit of sense of that. But occasionally there were visiting stars that would join in with these amateur performers. One called named Charlotte Crampton was quite well known throughout the United States, particularly for going around and doing certain Shakespeare speeches and set pieces. She did a number of the female characters, but she was very well known for playing Hamlet, Romeo, and Richard III. And she got really good reviews from the St. Paul Pioneer Press for her Richard III in the mid-1850s when she visited. Unfortunately, that wasn't quite the case for those poor soldiers at Fort Snelling. One of their last ventures in 1857 was to take their show, they thought it was pretty good, to the little town of Minneapolis. Well, the critics weren't quite so kind. They got a little bit of a drubbing and were sent back to Fort Snelling. And I think that's about the last we hear of the amateur theatrics out at historic Fort Snelling. Well, now I just want to take a moment and toggle out a little bit to talk about theater in the United States during this time period. From the colonial era till about 1800, the United States was dominated by a Puritan culture and a Puritan ethic, and that meant there was very little theater. And of course, we didn't have large population centers, so there wasn't a place really where a theater made sense to sort of establish itself as an industry. So the main thing that happened would be occasionally there would be a troupe from England would come over and do some popular British plays. But with the start of the 19th century, 1800, you saw a continual expansion of the United States and a great influx, of course, of immigrants coming into the large cities on the Eastern Coast. Nowhere more so, naturally, than New York City. And so with that density of population, then the theaters started to take off. And you can chart its rise throughout the 19th century until New York City and the Broadway area became the heart, the furnace, if you will, of the American theater for over a century. So it's here that plays were written, where they were produced, where they had their initial Broadway run. At that time, maybe 150 performers would be just fine. Then at the end of the season, that show might be bundled off onto the vast network of railways that were being built throughout the United States, and off they went to city after city after city to play large proscenium houses for maybe a week. Very popular, it might run 2, and then move on to the next city. In addition to these Broadway tours that were coming through, there were also in many cities, there developed local stock companies. These were companies of resident professional actors that might do an absolute facsimile of a Broadway production. So they get that script, they do the set exactly the same, they follow that same kind of blocking and do it very, very quickly so they could rehearse one week and then perform the next week. Well, in this period, which was, of course, predated any kind of electronic media, theater was one of the main forms of entertainment, along with sporting events, political rallies, I suppose, would also include going out to bars and restaurants and any kind of musical event. So theater really became big business during this time period. And there grew to be a number of different networks of theaters throughout the United States. The theatrical syndicate was the most powerful, where they would organize tours and they would either own theaters, manage theaters, or form partnerships with theater owners in other cities, where they could send these tours very, very efficiently around the United States. And they would set the terms and conditions for that. Later on, another group, the Schubert brothers, joined the act too and proved to be phenomenally successful. And they're now the Schubert organization that we know that still operates in New York City today. So theater was rapidly becoming a big business during the Gilded Age, during the late 19th and into the early years of the 20th century. Now you may be wondering, okay, well, what kind of shows were they doing at that time period? And they were a little bit different than what we do today. Particularly, there was enormous popularity for melodramas, very thrilling plots, a lot of twists and surprises and reveals. There were scenic effects. The 19th century theater folk really loved using all of the tools of the trade and doing a lot of different kind of special effects and things like that. There was also live music to sort of heighten the emotion of all of these different elements of the show. Probably the most famous, or one of the most famous, I should say, is Under the Gaslight, which featured a train that was going to run over someone who was tied to the tracks. And notice that in Under the Gaslight, it's actually the guy who's tied to the tracks, and it's the woman who bursts out and saves him. Well, in addition to melodramas, also popular were costume dramas, sort of period plays where they could show off a lot of beautiful gowns and a lot of sword play and things like that. Probably the most well-known, the one that's really come down to us as the biggest classic, would be Cyrano de Bergerac. But there were also many productions of Shakespeare during this time period, though, confess, a lot of these were greatly cut down and shaped, and they were pretty much overstuffed with a lot of scenery, and were there primarily for a couple big name actors to do their star turns. I just want to pause on one of them, who you can see right there, Ira Aldridge. Ira Aldridge was a wonderful actor who started working in the 1820s, I believe, as at the African Grove Theater, a wonderful black theater in New York City in the 1820s. He, of course, performed to great success roles like Othello and Aaron the Moor and Titus Andronicus, but became so disheartened, obviously, by the limitations caused by racism in the United States that he went to England to really broaden his opportunities, and to continental Europe, especially in Poland, where he played roles like you can see right here, King Lear. Well, in addition to that, there were also a lot of knockabout comedies that were being written and produced very successfully. And many of these featured sort of ridiculous kind of plots and absurd situations. And they might play on the immigrant humor of some of the more recent ethnic groups that were coming into the United States. They might be made by and for those kinds of audiences, or they might be making fun of those same kind of people. If it were a French farce, then it might have a little bit more of a bedroom farce or a naughty kind of feel to it. But there were many of these different kind of situational type comedies that were happening. Now, a little more sort of middle brow would be the so-called problem plays. These originated in France, and these were a very formulaic sort of beginning, middle, and end, where you might start off in a happy household, but then an incriminating letter might arrive, and that might expose someone's past, much to their chagrin. And through various complications, the tension just keeps rising, but there's always a happy ending at the end of it. Most of these plays are not plays that we do any longer, except there's a few of them, like those that Oscar Wilde wrote before The Importance of Being Earnest, shows like An Ideal Husband, which you see a picture of right here. And actually, Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House is a good example of an outstanding, well-made play for the time period. He uses all of those trappings, but then lifts it up to the level of art. There was a lot of musical theater in the 19th century. On kind of the higher end, opera was, of course, very popular, and its lighter, more tuneful cousin, operetta, both romantic, and those were more continental, think The Merry Widow and other sort of Viennese kind of operettas, or it could be comic. And the best examples of that are the operettas of Gilbert and Sullivan, Mikado, HMS Pinafore, and the Pirates of Penzance. But the United States and in Europe, there were a lot of variety theaters. And these were, as we talked about before, these were examples of shorter little acts. It could be song and dance, it could be comedy, it could be any variety of other things that were put together for a full evening of theater. The most popular format was vaudeville, that could play to a very broad range of people. And there were vaudeville houses all across the United States. So in addition to these legitimate theaters, there was entire networks of vaudeville houses. And these, in addition to those sort of more standard theatrical affair, I mean, you could see things like a short playlet with a great star in them or something. Sarah Bernhardt, people like that, often did vaudeville in sort of their endless farewell tours, but it could also include a lot of what we would classify as circus acts, magicians, jugglers, animal acts, and things like that, whatever might sell. There is one other form of variety entertainment that was extremely popular during this time period, and it's, of course, quite shameful and quite difficult to talk about, and that is the phenomenal success of the Minstrel Show that began roughly in the 1840s, that would consist of a group of white actors blackening up their faces, usually using grease paint or burnt cork. So, and then they would perform a show as African Americans inhabiting a lot of really shameful, racist tropes of the day. And these were done for comic effect. There were songs, there were jokes, there were parodies of like political stump speeches, and then there was usually some kind of satiric play, maybe about plantation life or something, and there were a lot of archetypal characters associated with that. That is a form that was enormously popular in the 19th century, like I said, and after the Civil War, there were even Black actors, male actors, and then also female troupes of minstrel show folks. In its complicated history, then we can also say, yes, that means that some Black performers were able to be seen on stage and were able to practice their craft and showcase their talents, but in a really very disgraceful kind of way. Happily, minstrel shows as a form sort of lost their popularity by around 1900, though the blackface form lingered on in vaudeville and really even into the early days of film. Well, enough said on that, I think. In the 19th century, if you went to the theater, you might encounter a curtain raiser to start you off, just a short little play as everyone was kind of gathering, a little appetizer. Then the main play would happen, and afterwards there would often be a farce. Think of that like a little bit of dessert. And there might be live music that might happen in between each of those, and there could even be some dancing afterwards. So it was really a very full evening of theater. Now, of all the different kind of plays that I've been talking about, probably the one title that was the most popular, especially in the mid-19th century, was Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, this was originally a novel, a huge novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, with a very sentimental plot, but it also had a strong abolitionist or anti-slavery theme. There were multiple competing stage versions that happened. Performance copyright, not really much of a thing. So anyone who wanted to could cobble together their own version of Uncle Tom's Cabin or a portion of it. And some could present it as a pro-slavery, Happy Uncle Tom kind of story, or the anti-slavery theme of the main novel. And this appeared in production after production again and again, often competing ones in the same city would be running. And in that larger photograph that you see right there is Abraham Lincoln in a scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin being lowered down, somehow giving his blessing or something like that. But this is actually from Gangs of New York, the Martin Scorsese film. And in this scene in the movie, they go to see Uncle Tom's Cabin. And as Leonardo DiCaprio enters, he walks by the poster advertising the show, and it says, featuring Harry Watkins as President Abraham Lincoln. Harry Watkins, our little fife and drum boy who played Desdemona out at Fort Snelling. I have never been able to figure out why Martin Scorsese put him in Gangs of New York, but there it is. If someone has the answer, let me know. That would be fascinating to find out. So there he is, a little bit of immortality for our buddy Harry Watkins. Well, toggling back once again to Minnesota, how was all this playing out in this area? And the Twin Cities is a great representative of the sort of regional theater stop for theater during this time period. As you see in the Frank Whiting book, Minnesota Theater, where I have that longer quote right there, a couple of areas in red sort of give you the highlight, the most important period in commercial theatrical activity in Minnesota, where it was not only regarded as business, but as big business. So as Minneapolis and St. Paul exploded in their population, so too did the theaters. And one after another, theaters got bigger and bigger and fancier and fancier. And during this 50-year period plus, there were many theaters located in each of the cities and in cities and towns throughout Minnesota. You can see the ones from Duluth and from Stillwater. And this is where all of those tours coming out of New York City or resident stock companies would perform. A lot of text here on this page, so let me just handle it pretty quickly. So exactly like I said, tours coming through. Edwin Booth took a look at the St. Paul Opera House, did not find it suitable, and instead went to Minneapolis, whereupon the Pioneer Press had to opine that the people of St. Paul are subjected to the mortification and inconvenience of having to go to Minneapolis. Fortunately, a fellow named L.N. Scott came along and was the longtime manager of the new Minneapolis and St. Paul opera houses, and he also managed theaters in Duluth and in Superior for nearly 40 years, and he was a terrific manager. So the Twin Cities and the greater Minnesota area were able to receive a lot of terrific tours and be able to see a lot of the great stars of the day, again, performing the kind of light entertainment, if you will, of that time period. I do want to call your attention to the poster for James O'Neill in The Count of Monte Cristo. He was a well-known Shakespearean actor who found this great piece, this swashbuckling kind of costume drama of Monte Cristo, and he played that again and again for year after year after year and sort of got locked into that role. And that's what often happened with a lot of the great stars of that time period. That's how they made their money, is finding that kind of vehicle piece. So much so that it in its ability to overshadow poor James O'Neill, that his son, Eugene O'Neill, wrote his masterpiece a generation later, Long Day's Journey into Night, about their family's many difficulties and his father's chagrin about being locked into this one vehicle piece earlier in his life. Now, the other form, in addition to tours, were the stock companies. As I had mentioned before, these would be a company of regional actors. They would present one show per week, was the most common way to do it, where they would perform one in the evening and they'd be rehearsing during the day, and then the next week they would move on to that new show would open and it would perform. Others have sort of counted up during this time period, and it's 50 years or so, over 40 different stock companies. Some just lasted for a very short period of time. Some might have gone away to other cities, others disbanded, and a new group would form, and they would play a lot of this commercial kind of fare, melodramas, farces, well-made plays, and things like that. Though there was one group called the Bainbridge Players that lasted for over 20 years, and they performed at the Schubert Theater, which you see pictured here in Minneapolis, and they were really known throughout the region and enormously successful for the high quality of the acting, the excellence of the productions, and the high literary quality of the scripts that they were doing, classics and some of the newer writers like Eugene O'Neill, as well as the latest Broadway shows. The theater that they performed at, the Schubert Theater, tells sort of an interesting story of some of these great palaces, large proscenium theater, 1,500 seats. So that's what they were looking at trying to sell per night. Now, just by way of contrast, the Guthrie Theater is 1,100 seats, so it's significantly larger than that. And that was one of many theaters located in Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So after it had been served its day as a theater, then it became a movie theater, then it appeared a little more as a burlesque kind of strip club, and then became a church. Talk about a 180 right there. And in 1999, the theater was moved in an extraordinary moving job, where it went about a block and a half away and is now seated on Hennepin Avenue in downtown Minneapolis and is known as the Cole Center, a theater that's used primarily for dance. Now, some of the other theaters built during this time period are really illustrate sort of these grand palaces, proscenium theaters, very large, so big tours could just park themselves in there. They could play to enormous houses. The Orpheum Theater in Minneapolis, built in 1921, a little towards the end of this era, is a great example of that. And the Orpheum Theater to today has continued to do that kind of programming through the Hennepin Theater Trust of the Orpheum, the State, and the Pantages Theater. Here is their exciting 2021 season. Because of coronavirus, none of that happened. but hopefully next year. Over in St. Paul, one that still remains was originally another Schubert theater, later became the World Theater and showed movies. And then it became restored as the Fitzgerald Theater. And for a long time, it was the primary home of Prairie Home Companion, the live public radio show hosted by Garrison Keillor. And there you see an interior of that. I believe maybe it might be around 700 seats, and it's now owned by First Avenue and used for multiple kind of events, tipping a little more towards concert experiences. But there are theaters like this throughout the nation, and just in our area, some of the ones that I really like are the Mabel Tainter Theater in Menomonee, Wisconsin. Beautiful exterior in the Richardsonian Romanesque kind of style. You can go and take a tour of it. It's really lovely. And the interior of it is just glorious, a wonderful little proscenium stage of that time period that is still used today for community theater and a lot of different kinds of events. Just the same is the Sheldon Theater in Red Wing, Minnesota. You see the exterior of that and the interior, lovely, very well appointed. And even in the small town of Mantorville, their opera house is still used by the community theater, and they also specialize in an annual program of melodramas. So a great way to experience and maybe laugh a little bit at some of the 19th century theatrical forms. I do want to pause just a moment to talk about all of the different immigrant groups that were pouring into the United States at the time, so much so that they created various sort of little niche audiences and different kinds of theater, so that those people who just wanted to have an experience maybe in their original language or hear their stories told or seen on stage could go to some of these theaters. Yiddish theater was a huge area on 2nd Avenue, just not too far from Broadway in New York City. And that was an enormous feed for a lot of talent that later went on to Broadway and formed the New York Theater. But there were different kind of communities like this throughout the United States. In Minnesota, the German community in New Ulm, Minnesota, was probably one of the most significant. And just by way of an example, since I mentioned before, I used to work at the James J. Hill House. Here are a picture of two of their servants. The one sitting is the head cook, Lena Peterson, and standing alongside is Celia Tower. Lena Peterson was a Swedish immigrant. Celia was born to German Catholic immigrant parents in the town of New Ulm in south central Minnesota. And when she was here, she wrote letters back to her boyfriend, who was a chauffeur and a mechanic in New Ulm. And she would include comments like, oh, Lena and I went out to see this play. Now we went to that play. We went to a concert. We did this, that, and the other, which sort of talks about, like, you know, even what we think of as, or people who were servants in large houses, normally regularly went out and attended theater and other performing arts events. And she would mention to her boyfriend, her fiance, who she later married, she would say, oh, you know, when the Rosary comes to New Ulm, be sure to go see it. So that she knew, and her boyfriend knew, that, you know, these are different troupes that are coming along and they'll perform here. And then maybe next month they might show up in New Ulm. Now, in addition to sort of some of the Irish Catholic theater, some of the German theater that I just talked about, like the Turner Hall in New Ulm, there were also a lot of Scandinavians, of course, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And one of their biggest stars was Hjalmar Peterson, who went by his stage name, Ole from Laughterville. And here are a couple pictures of Ole, and he had his own troupe and they would do plays, and Ole was often featured as a little bit of the host, doing a little bit of sort of stand-up comedy, some funny songs, welcoming the audience, and then he'd turn it over and then the play would happen. So he was a really remarkable star for many, many years in the Scandinavian theater area. So when he was performing in Minneapolis, he might perform at a place like the Southern Theater on the West Bank of Minneapolis, because that was an area where there were a lot of Scandinavians and where they regularly did a lot of variety kind of performances, exactly in keeping with the kind of thing that Ole from Laughterville would do. The Southern Theater, though, as time went on, was later, like a lot of places, became a burlesque house and then a movie theater. And it was, the exterior was changed so much, it barely seems like the same building. But it was restored once again in more recent years, where it's gone back to being a live theater for theater and dance kind of events. And one of the things that has been happening for about the last 20 years or so is a Saturday midnight show called Balls, created by a woman named Leslie Ball, and it features a changing lineup of music, of theater, comedy, short little performance art pieces. So often, as they said, experimental, and it's entertainment as well. So here's Leslie Ball with Ari Hotman, very funny guy. They're both really funny, talented, wonderful people right there. And it looks like they're going through some little sketch. And it's just very heartwarming for me to think that, oh, now Leslie and Ari are there doing pretty much exactly the same thing that Ole from Laughterville did, oh, about 100 years ago in the same place. Well, this huge rush of theatrical activity went on merrily throughout the 19th century and gained steam right at the turn of the 20th century until it hit 1929. And then the perfect storm happened. And theater in the United States, around the world, nearly died out. Stock companies as a form disappeared. Vaudeville as a form pretty much vanished. Tours kept going, but they decreased a lot. And there were many, many empty theaters. Many of them then were torn down. Obviously, what had happened in 1929 was a stock market crash and an economic collapse. And then the Dust Bowls of the Midwest continued the Great Depression for over 10 years. That was, of course, followed by the disruption of World War II. But there was also something else that was happening, and that was the introduction of electronic media. Radio, movies, and a little bit later, television. So if you were a person living in the 1930s and you didn't have very much money at all, you probably weren't going to buy a ticket to a vaudeville show when you could just turn on the radio and there would be Bing Crosby with his special guest, Judy Garland. Or if you wanted to see a musical or something like that, you wouldn't buy a ticket for one. You'd go see Fred and Ginger on the silver screen. So the combination of the economics, World War II, and the changes in technology really put a damper on theatrical activity throughout the whole United States and in the Twin Cities. Question that many were wondering was, would theater return in the greater area of the country? And if it did, when and how? Well, of course, theater as a whole didn't die. Broadway did retrench, and a number of the best people, of course, went hopping off to Hollywood for greater fame. A lot of the shows that were done then, their opulent sort of over-the-top chorus girl reviews, Ziegfeld Follies and things like that, well, they either retrenched or went away. But weirdly, Broadway actually got better in some respects. The plays were better. The musicals were better. And it's during this time period, during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, that you could say American theater started to grow up. And if we even want to think about Aristotle for a moment, who said, all plays need to have a consistent plot, believable characters, a heightened and appropriate language. They need to be about something, and there can be spectacle, but that's the least important thing in a play. We can see that Broadway and American theater was kind of following suit in that time period. And so many of the works that we think of as our great American canon for many years were really born at this time period where there was still an audience, a large commercial middle-class audience of people willing to see shows like this. But they didn't rely on the enormous volume of trade just to keep it running throughout the entire United States. There was another thing that happened, and it was the birth of the little theater movement. This is the return, if you will, some of maybe like our soldiers from Fort Snelling suddenly became the folks in the church basement instead. people who wanted to get together after a day's work and work on and put on a show. And the little theater movement eventually evolved into what was known as the community theater movement. And in Minnesota, we've had a number of them that bubbled up early in the 19th century, and many of them in the middle of the 19th century that are still around and producing to this very day. Tours, as I said, continued even though the number dropped, so the major musicals still came through and played some of the touring houses, and the Theater Guild in New York also took up the banner of presenting more the lighter popular classics of the day. So you could see Alfred Lunt-Fontanne in The Taming of the Shrew, for example. And also during these middle decades in the 20th century, educational theater started to take off. So at high schools like St. Paul Central and Minneapolis-South kind of leading the way, you had more theater productions started happening, and at the college and university level, that began happening as well. In 1897 at the U of M, for extracurricular kind of projects, plays would be put on, and then eventually they thought, well, this is something we could actually study. We could actually train people to become actors and designers and technicians. And this eventually evolved into departments and majors and graduate programs at a number of our colleges and universities. And this is the kind of thing that was happening all throughout the United States. Now, I had mentioned that the stock theaters had gone away during that time period, except for one expression of them that hung on. And this became summer stock, the sort of straw hat circuit at vacation and resort areas, where, again, you would have a group of actors who would be doing one sort of popular entertainment piece that they'd be performing at night while they were rehearsing another one during the day, and then usually sort of in a weekly turnover, then you would have a new show that would come on board. Old Log Theater on Lake Minnetonka, to the west of Minneapolis, was originally a summer stock theater, and now it's one of our oldest and largest commercial venture theaters in the area. And up north in the Lake Districts, there's the Paul Bunyan Playhouse and Theater La Hamadou that each in slightly different ways are continuing the summer stock tradition. The University of Minnesota also acquired a big paddle wheel boat and created a showboat, a 19th century unique phenomenon to the United States at that time period. And in 1958, centennial of Minnesota, then it launched a summer series where they were usually performing some of the kinds of shows that were done in the 19th century, either like popular classics or old melodramas, sometimes played for a little more comedy value, as well as some of the variety acts as olios in between the regular play. So they had one showboat, a second one replaced that many years later. And that one was used by the University of Minnesota up until 2016. Sadly, it stopped then. Just a couple of years ago, it was moved down to Winona, Minnesota, and I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with it. So hopefully we'll see live entertainment once again on the Minnesota Centennial Showboat. Well, thinking back during this sort of fallow period of just like, how would theater come back? How and when and where? And who would be doing it? All of a sudden, there emerged on the scene this fellow. Tyrone Guthrie was one of the leading directors of theater really throughout the world in the mid-20th century. He certainly had his share of Broadway hits. He certainly had a share of West End London hits and was particularly distinguished in the classics. However, he was just getting a little bit tired and worn out by the increasing commercialization of Broadway, about the higher costs. And he looked around and he thought, like, well, look at all of these other cities around here, especially in North America. Why aren't there any theaters there? They need to have one. And he started in Canada in his quest. And with the brilliant designer, Tanya Mosevich, they developed a kind of model on the Elizabethan globe or the ancient Greek thrust stage, and they developed the Stratford Festival Theatre in Southern Ontario that opened in 1953 and continues to this day. I think they have 4 theaters now in that town. And it's really one of the wonderful places to go see classical repertory theater on a very, very high level. Well, once that was launched, Tyrone Guthrie said, okay, United States, how about you? And he pretty much said so in an ad in the New York Times. What theater wants it? What kind of deal can you give me? And I'll come and do the same thing in your town. Many cities sent in proposals, and eventually some of the civic leaders in Minneapolis took a look around, and as you see from this little quote, one of the city leaders and the business leaders said, look, we've got a pretty good symphony, we've got a full-line museum in the Institute, but no theater to speak of. Already people have forgotten about the huge theatrical activity that used to be in the town, but only a couple road shows and Don Stoltz's Old Log. Couldn't see anything else. So they made their bid, and eventually it came down to, in Tyrone Guthrie's quip, Minnie or Millie, which shall it be, Minneapolis or Milwaukee? And of course, Minneapolis won out. And as the American Theater magazine said in 2015, it probably was the single event that became the most potent symbol of the simultaneous burgeoning and decentralization of the American theater, with the establishment of the Guthrie in Minneapolis. And as Tyrone Guthrie said, we are planting an oak tree. He was very much cognizant that they were making a radical change and hoping that it would spread to other cities throughout the United States. He used a local architect, Ralph Rapson, designed a similar thrust stage, but with a more modern design exterior, and the whole city, it seems, sort of got behind him with a group called the Stagehands, a women's auxiliary group of volunteers who sold 88,000 tickets to the first season. And when it opened with Hamlet in 1963, I think the Newsweek quote kind of sums it up. It was probably the most important theater opening of a generation. And in the seasons that followed, Tyrone Guthrie did a trilogy of Aeschylus plays, The House of Atreus, that went to New York, went to Broadway. A number of years later, through Michael Langham's, when he was the artistic director, they began the annual holiday adaptation of A Christmas Carol, a tradition that has spread to theaters throughout the United States as the big sort of signature moneymaker. And it was also a way for theaters to introduce new audiences to a theater-going experience. The Guthrie also expanded in different ways at different times to other smaller, more experimental places in the Twin Cities, to regional tours, and eventually doing a renovation of that exterior and an expansion of the lobby for its original Vineland place in 1992. But a few years after that, a new Guthrie Theater was built. It was built on the right on the banks of the Mississippi River, while Joe Dowling was the artistic director. And it opened in 2006 with 3 theaters, a pretty close facsimile of the original Guthrie, a large proscenium theater, and an experimental black box flexible stage up on the top of the theater. And now continues under the artistic direction of Joe Hodge. There were, of course, theaters that predated the Guthrie, so we don't want to overstate the importance of the Guthrie Theater. And there were many theaters that came along afterwards in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to the 21st century. And many of these theaters hired equity actors or professional theaters. And most of them that you see on this particular image have their own production facilities. But these aren't the only theaters that are operating right now in the Twin Cities. There are many other groups, professional, community-wise, that move around to different locations and that don't have a permanent theater address. But as these different images, these different logos start accumulating, you can really see what an extraordinary expression of this particular art form in cities the size of St. Paul and Minneapolis. And in addition to those which are all operating right now, oh, here's our little tribute section to those that have come and gone. Here are some of the theaters that have had a profound impact on the Twin Cities theater scene, but are no longer with us. Now, it could be that the people involved just moved on and did other things, their original mission, they just felt it was done, it was time to go. Economics, other issues may have got in the way, but it's an amazing legacy of other theaters that have been here during the last 50, 60 years. Wow. Well, here's a little recap. So if you go back to Fort Snelling time period, on the bottom you have dates and the amount of theater in Minnesota on the vertical axis. I know, not a very scientific graph right there, but it starts off with almost nothing when Fort Snelling began. As the area expanded, theater expanded, and it reached its peak right after the Civil War, all the way until 1929, 1930, and then it sort of fell off the cliff right there in that perfect storm that we talked about. Now, maybe it wasn't quite as vertical a drop as you see on my little silly graph right there, but it was profound and it was significant. It didn't completely go away, but it dropped precipitously. And then starting in the 1960s, you see it rise back up again, not as big as it was before in terms of number of tickets sold or, butts in seats, but still quite significant for a number, especially in the number of different kinds of theater companies in one metropolitan area. And it goes up to 2020, where everything stopped. And everything stopped, when I'm recording this, about a year ago in the middle of March of 2020 with the coronavirus pandemic, and has been closed now, pretty much all the theater in the area, for the last year. And it looks like, fingers crossed, we'll do some outdoor theater perhaps this summer, and maybe theater will be coming back in its new normal form starting in the fall of 2021. So what we've just looked at in these last 50, 60 years is the revolution of the American regional theater. Just a completely new model of what theater is, why we go to theater, why we make theater, and how theater happens. So what we've been talking about with a lot of the theaters from the Guthrie and many of those others are a professional, institutional, nonprofit theater company, often, but not always, with its own facility. They do a season of plays, fulfilling a certain mission. They're doing it for entertainment value, but also as an expression of theater as an art form, which wasn't the impetus in the grand old days of that 19th century theater. And a lot of this was happening in tandem with other changes that were happening in United States society. So in the 1960s rather, city leaders were starting to think that they wanted a theater just like they had their own orchestra, ballet, opera, all of the other different museums, and all of the other sort of livability amenities that great cities had. This was in tandem with the Kennedy administration, very much interested in arts and culture, and on the congressional level, through a lot of the initiatives during LBJ's Great Society changes. We have things like the National Endowment for the Arts, nonprofit guidelines, which meant theaters could be tax exempt, and you could take a tax deduction, and they could receive public and corporate foundation monies. And Minnesota actually preceded that a little bit on the state level, as you see. So it went from maybe around 23 regional theaters at the beginning of the 1960s to at the beginning of the 21st century, over 1,200, including over 60 in the Twin Cities. Many more. I'm kind of wondering about those numbers. So almost all cities of any size in the United States have at least one professional theater company of this sort. And many cities have more, and some are devoted to new work, and some do sort of the classic canon. All states in the United States have a Shakespeare Festival theater, and many do a combination with a lot of various kinds of outreach and educational kind of programs. And throughout all of these independent theaters, who are each doing their new productions of all of these different kinds of works, there is a network of different organizations that sort of string these theaters together to sort of create common work practices, standards, sort of general welfare, both for professional theaters and also for community theater network. So if we think about like these two different periods of theater, if you think about like, well, why do people go to the theater? It was very much the case that in the 19th and early 20th century, pre-electronic media, theater was one of the main forms of entertainment. So in an industrial revolution, and where you have a lot of people who are in the city working a factory job or an office job, what to do in the evening, go to the theater was one of the main vehicles to do. Now we look at theater a little bit differently. Certainly it's to be entertained, but it follows a smaller, more niche kind of market of people who are interested in that as an art form and might also be interested in the social implications of theater. They want to learn about other groups of people or other different kinds of literature of different time periods. They want to take action on a social justice issue, and they want their souls to be nourished aesthetically, spiritually. And so if we then turn our attention to, well, exactly how does this happen nowadays? Knowing that we have professional theaters, we have community theaters of amateurs, we have educational theater on the high school and college level and younger level. And there are also tours that are coming through commercial theater from Broadway that are sitting at the Orpheum or the Ordway Theater in St. Paul. But for the most part, theaters are nonprofit organizations. Some like Chanhassen and Old Log are commercial ventures, and there have been some others along the way. So they exist on, the nonprofit theaters exist on ticket sales and other forms of earned income, might include concessions, rental, educational programs, but then they also receive significant public funding, foundation grants, corporate and individual gifts, so people can donate money to theaters to support the cause. Many of these theaters are, especially the larger ones, end up having two sort of wings to the organization. One is the creative side, which includes the director, the actors, the designers, all of the technicians, and then there might generally be another administrative wing, which could include things like fundraising, marketing, other kind of facility operations and educational efforts. And most of these theaters produce in spaces that might range from 100 seats or less up to the 1,100 of the Guthrie Theater and the Orpheum, which is considerably larger. Most of the individual shows are planned out maybe close to a year in advance at many theaters, where the show is selected, a director is hired, the designers come on board, and the planning and the design process happen. Auditions might happen. The show is cast, and then about 3 to 5 weeks before opening, then rehearsals begin in the last intensive part, with the show opening for a run of maybe from 3 to 6 weeks, and that might be equal to about 10 to about 50 performances. I mentioned most shows are not Mamma Mia. Mamma Mia was a particularly big hit at Chanhassen Dinner Theater, which ran 54 weeks, I believe, and over 400 performances. So that would be an exceptionally long run for the Twin Cities area. And I think you could also say that for many other theaters and shows in cities around the United States, unless it's a really especially tailored kind of long running sort of little event attraction kind of show. So you may be wondering, how do you learn to work in the theater? And it used to be in the old days, you would learn through apprenticeships, through watching and doing, working with a theater company. Today, it pretty much starts with getting a college degree, a BA, a BFA, an MFA in one of the different areas of theater. But it also does include those same things: doing, asking, observing, starting at a smaller theater and working your way up to a larger theater. One of the better known programs in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area is the BFA Actor Training Program at the University of Minnesota in conjunction with the Guthrie Theater that takes up to 20 BFA students and turns them out over a 4-year period. It's a classical actor training program. The picture there are a number of people that I worked with in recent years, and they're all pretty wonderful people. So I like that program a lot. Now, if you're thinking about getting a job in the theater, how do you go about doing that? Well, you have to audition, of course. And the auditions are, when they happen, are usually listed in at a website, Minnesota Playlist. So, you send in or you bring in, schedule your audition, you bring in your headshot. This is my first one from the early 1980s. And your resume, and you audition for the show and get hired that way. Directors, designers, and tech jobs, that often happens most just through simple networking. So I'm not sure that there is as formal, regular formal process. And a lot of times theaters that have their own facilities will hire their own technical director, resident stage manager, and have a number of regular designers that might work in their space on an ongoing basis. The question always comes up about the economics of working in theater, and it's not great. Can you really make a living doing theater? And when I've asked this question, excuse me, in other forums, people have said, not really. Let's look at it through a couple different lenses. I'm pretty lucky that as a non-equity actor and someone who also directs regularly, I get to work a lot. So here are the shows that I did starting in, as I started prepping, maybe about April of 2019 up until mid-March of 2020 when all the theaters closed. So almost a year. And I know we're never supposed to talk about money, but here goes. I'm going to. I was going to do, scheduled to direct Oklahoma and Summerstock in Iowa, but at the same time, I got another offer of a gig to do a show, to do Importance of Being Earnest at Rochester Civic Theater that opened one day apart from Oklahoma. So it's in 2 different states, about an hour apart. I said yes to that, and I figured out the schedule and drove back and forth and hit a deer on the last night. This was too bad. But the reason I did that is because theater people stretch themselves thin and need to take the work when they can get the work. And it's because that second one that came in at the last moment paid $5,000 to direct it. And I've done Importance of Being Earnest 5 times. So I thought, like, okay, if there's a show that I can do and know exactly what I need to do, it would be that one. So that would be, for me, at least, in kind of the middle of the pack kind of director's fees, and they're all over the map. That would be a good gig. The Oklahoma one paid $2,500. Then I went back to Minneapolis and directed a short little museum play. It was only 12 minutes long, and it's one that I wrote and had done before. So that was just fine to do that. Back down to Iowa for another directing gig, 9 to 5, and then another little museum show. So another little $800. Then flipped over to acting a little bit where I don't make as much money. And then another acting gig, again, where I made a little less money. But then guess what? Rochester Civic Theater said, we lost our director and we need someone to direct Elf, the musical. Sure, I can make myself available for $5,000. Back to the Twin Cities for a little Christmas story Readers Theater program. That's just fine. And then guess what? Rochester Civic Theater said, we've lost a director. Would you be able to direct another show? You bet I would. And then finally, another little theater with some of those BFA folks that I showed just on the previous slide. I did St. Joan, and that all came to my theater earnings for almost a year, $25,600, plus a few other little gigs right there. So I'm someone that can double up a lot of projects and gets to work all the time too. And if you hustle like that, you can make that amount of money, and I'll let you be the judge whether that's appropriate or sufficient. I should mention that right after that St. Joan closed a week early. My next 3 theater gigs then all got canceled because of COVID. So I've been largely unemployed, except for some virtual stuff and some additional hustling that I came up with. Let's look at it through another lens. Let's say you're a member of Actors Equity Association, so a union actor, just at getting and maintaining healthcare through the union, which is good if you get the number of weeks in per year to maintain uh, your health insurance. So at the top, my friend David Buchema, who I met, wonderful actor, I cast him in that production of The Importance of Being Earnest down at Rochester Civic Theater. And he said, thank you, thank you, thank you. That gave him just barely the extra weeks so that he would be able to extend his healthcare coverage for another 6 months through Actors Equity. The same thing with my friend Mo Perry, who I first started working with in community theater. She's an equity actor right now, terrific actor, and here we are in the Jungle Theater's production of The Nether. And throughout The Nether, she was just like, oh, please, please, please let us be a hit, because then we extend by 1 week. And if we extend by 1 week, then I can get enough weeks in so that I can extend my health care for another 6 months. And yes, we got extended. And so she got the healthcare coverage for another half year there. But that's the kind of stress and tension that's not even part of the art form that people have to live and work with. So that's what it feels like as a professional actor. Now, I wanted to spend a moment talking about 4 different theaters in the Twin Cities, really, really briefly, and their impact that they've had in different areas. The first one that I want to mention is Theater in the Round Players. This is the arena theater, community theater that's been around since the early 1950s for their outstanding programming and the way that they have influenced and given sort of a showcase kind of liftoff to not only other individual performers in the Twin Cities, but were something of a launching pad for other theater companies. From TRP, you can trace some of the people who worked there as they went forward and formed groups like Mixed Blood Theater Company, Penumbra, Theater Moo, and Out and About, an LGBTQ theater that's no longer around, but because of the really forward-thinking programming of some of the early titles in sort of the gay theater movement in the 1960s and 70s, that really gave the appropriate platform to know that there is an audience for those kinds of shows. Now, another one completely different is a Theater de la Jeune Lune, a company of half French and half American actors who got together, first going back and forth between Paris and Minneapolis, and creating theater that was that really traded on a lot of the European clowning traditions, very visual, movement-based, and very imaginative exploration of not only new works, but also the classical canon. So much so that they were awarded the Tony Award for regional theater, maybe around 2005 or so. I'm not sure if I have that date exactly right. And as is typical for a lot of people in theater companies, even though Theater de la Jeune Lune is no longer around, almost all of those people are. And you can see them at different theaters around in the Twin Cities area or around in areas around the country. Another really important theater in musical theater would be Theater Latte Dao, which is now housed in the Ritz Theater in Northeast Minneapolis under the artistic direction of one of its founders, Peter Rothstein. And in addition to doing really imaginative productions of sort of standard existing musical theater fare, they've also developed a number of new works by composers who come in from other places. And one piece that Peter himself created is All Is Calm, about the truce between the French, English, and German soldiers in 1914 during World War I. And it went to New York in 2019, I believe, and received a Drama Desk Award and was also filmed for public television and broadcast. The fourth one is 10,000 Things Theater Company, which was developed by their founding artistic director, Michelle Hensley, and takes stripped down minimalist works to homeless shelters, to prisons, and to other places where people normally would not see theater or even think of going to theater, maybe even what theater is. And this would range from doing very imaginative versions of Shakespeare. I'm in the corner right there in a production of, all-male production of Richard III playing the Duchess of York, and also doing musicals. You see Man of La Mancha in the other image right there. And these would be done just in whatever sort of found space there would be at any of these institutions, as Michelle's saying, would be, with all the lights on. So just getting in the middle of a group of chairs and doing the show, and then moving on to a different place every day for each different performance. And this is a model that's been emulated at many other, or at a number of other theaters throughout the United States now, bringing theater to people who would normally not go and would not see it. There are a couple other associated and very flourishing kind of opportunities in the Twin Cities. I just call them gateway drugs. I don't know if that's appropriate, but it's for all of the various improv and sketch comedy kind of venues that we have here, going back to, I believe that in the 1950s with Dudley Riggs and the Brave New Workshop and many other improv groups and smaller little kind of cafe kind of settings, imaginative places like the Bryant Lake Bowl, a bowling alley that has a small cabaret theater next to it. I did a one-man show of The Diary of Samuel Pepys there, of all things. Why not? The other thing, and actually where The Diary of Samuel Pepys, that one-person show began, was at the Minnesota Fringe Festival, where for, I would say, over 25 years now, this kind of 10-day summer festival sort of takes over many of the theaters in the Twin Cities, and you can see an incredible number of different performing arts groups, mainly theater, but also some dance and music and everything in between, being performed. And people, when they go to the Fringe Festival, as they do in the Fringe festivals throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe, you start with one, and then the next hour you go find another one, then you find another, and it really gets people into the swing of going to show after show after show after show after show. And that brings me to the question of, why is there so much theater in the Twin Cities? And the top answer has to be because there are people who will buy tickets and will go see it. And once you start going to see theater, it has that snowball effect, and you're interested in going back and seeing what that same theater might be doing next. Or you might want to follow that actor. Where are they going next, and what will they do? Or you figure out the kind of shows I like are this show, that show, and the other one. And then you start going around and doing it that way. The education system in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, is very strong. And at many theaters, there are also summer camps and classes that kids can sign up for, start them young, right? And there are many field trips, daytime matinees that are offered at many of the theaters. Particularly, I would say Park Square Theater does a really good job at offering student matinees and giving them that kind of theater experience, as well as theaters that are just dedicated to doing shows for young people. Children's theater, of course, Stages and Stepping Stone, and a number of other ones. Theater is also prevalent in so many of our elementary and high schools. And at the high school level, the One Act Play Festival and the Spotlight Festival for musical theater are two of the great showcases that take a look at that at a high school level. And by the time you get to college and universities, there are many programs throughout the Twin Cities that are doing that at colleges. And I just want to give a little shout out for Arthur Ballot. I took his intro to theater when I was an undergrad at the University of Minnesota in 1979 or so. And these really dazzling lectures that he had were so spellbinding that they would fill up every quarter, I think we called them. So we would do them 3 times a year in the largest theater at the University of Minnesota. So you would have hundreds of students. So a couple thousand, it seemed like every year, would take these classes and then go out and see shows as part of the class. And then they were nurtured to become the theater-going audiences of today. Jack Ruler, the founding artistic director of Mixed Blood Theater, has this wonderful quote: "When fundraisers die, they go to Minneapolis. Public funding, foundation funding, individual donors, and corporate sponsorships underwrite a lot of the work that happens in Twin Cities theater." So it's a very generous and well-supported community. There is also a larger community of related arts and humanities, all of the other performing arts, visual arts, and museums. So for someone like me, who was able to do theater and then also work for the Minnesota Historical Society managing a historic house museum, that meant that was an opportunity to sort of go across some of these different fields. And all of that contributes to the sort of livability standards within the Twin Cities, so that someone like me could live a life like that and have a nice house in South Minneapolis and take a super early retirement from my day job at the James J. Hill House and devote myself full-time professionally to doing theater. So those are some of the reasons that have contributed to the quality and the quantity of the theater-going activity in this area. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some future trends in this last little part of this unending talk, isn't it? One would be community theaters, the amateur theaters, very well done in the Twin Cities area, and how they have been changing to greater professionalization. So some of the theaters that are popping up right now in the Twin Cities and around have all improved their facilities, are starting to hire equity actors, to pay all their actors, and kind of hit all the benchmarks for that. One that hasn't done that is the one I featured earlier, Theater in the Round Players. And so it'll be interesting to see if they follow suit or if they continue on the same way. But it isn't all a bed of roses. One example of that I've already sort of alluded to. Rochester Civic Theater very suddenly over the last about 2 years ago decided its long tradition of being a community theater left it kind of dusty. And so they wanted to become a professional theater. They did it too quickly. They did it without the buy-in from the community, particularly the other theater community folk in Rochester. I was one of the lucky ones because out of the blue, then I got those 3 different kind of high-paying jobs that could bring in and was encouraged to bring in people from other professionals to come and do shows there. Rochester's a pretty big theater, pretty big city rather. They should have a professional theater. It all seemed like a good thing. They were burning bridges and they were burning through their finances way too quickly. So while we've had other community theaters take steps forward and build new facilities and work on their professionalization, in one instance, it went too far too quickly, and it was a crash and burn. They are still there, I'm so glad to say, and now operating once again as a community theater, and we'll see what it looks like in the future for them. Another thing that's been happening here and throughout theater in the United States, but I think very richly in the Twin Cities area, are site-specific productions. These are shows that happen in non-traditional spaces where theater normally doesn't happen, but there might be some resonance between the actual physical location and the topic of the play. Frank Theater has been, I think, really remarkable in doing a number of shows in really imaginative kind of locations, particularly for plays that take a look at a lot of more social justice kind of issues from a different lens. I'm glad to say that I've had a little bit of a part in that in terms of developing site-specific theater pieces for the James J. Hill House that might be about the story of the Hill House and might actually portray people who I mentioned earlier, like Celia Tower and Lena Peterson. But then I moved on with that and opened it up so that other groups could come in and do shows at the James J. Hill House. So various other organizations have come in and used that place. And there's a little bit sort of an unspoken kind of dialogue that happens between the production itself and the environment that people might be in. It gives a sort of unique and evocative kind of experience. It's also cheaper for a lot of theater companies because you don't have to build a set, and it's also greener in that aspect. So you don't have to spend as much usually on the set, and you don't have as much that you're throwing away, and you might be using a little less sort of energy in terms of sound and lights. And there's a whole set of other issues too that the theater has been facing, both here in the Twin Cities and around in show business just in general in the United States, that our culture has been wrestling with. And it's certainly true of the Twin Cities theater communities. Now, in terms of just LGBTQ and theater produced by women. There's a very interesting history with theaters like Out and About, who I mentioned before, feminist theater collective called At the Foot of the Mountain. In more recent years, we've seen all female productions of like Two Gentlemen of Verona that you see. There's been a handoff of leadership to women, Sarah Bellamy succeeding her father, Lou Bellamy, at Penumbra, pictured right there, but many other examples of that. Some theaters taking a very intensive kind of look at their programming. History Theater rebranding itself for a season for Her Story Theater. And again, not all a bed of roses and not all progress without bumps along the way. Park Square Theater had a very difficult time with a new artistic director and are in the process of making a number of changes. And so we'll see where that lands them in the end. In terms of space, the theater community could use some other rental spaces and some better rehearsal and production facilities when theater does come back. The loss of places like the Theater Garage in South Minneapolis, particularly painful for me because I did so many shows there, and many of the smaller to mid-sized kind of professional theater companies did so much great work at spaces like that. So we need to have more of those available. Probably the biggest crisis that the theater community has faced has been the Children's Theater Company allegations of a long history of sexual abuse of minors at their school and in their theater, dating back probably to the 1960s, but it initially came up as an issue in the 1983, I believe it was, where many people in the broader community thought like, well, thank goodness that's been dealt with. But then in more recent years, it's come to light that the people who were there at that time period had allegations against many other people at the theater, and even the theater's current ownership, although there in no way is that happening nowadays, their ownership of this history and that past problem has been a heavy, heavy legacy as it's landed on the theater community, and a great deal of angst and difficulty over that issue, not only at CTC, but it's led to issues surrounding other individuals at other theaters. Getting exposed to the light is helping somewhat, and it is definitely an ongoing journey. As part of that, there is a group of Minnesota Theater Accountability Coalition, a group of leaders in the theater community who are involved dialoguing and writing standards to address issues on all of these topics, particularly safe spaces for everyone and the inclusion of everyone. So addressing some of the statements that I have here: whose stories gets told, who embodies the story, who's creating the production, looking at all of those different angles, and to make sure that that happens in a safe way. I'm glad to say in just a very small way, I've been participating in that, and I hope that turns out to be the kind of documents and the kind of information that can be shared and that can be embodied by all of the theater makers within the Twin Cities, an ongoing story. In terms of recognition, the Twin Cities theater community has kind of dealt with a couple different sort of like awards and, you know, end of the year lists and things like that. Probably one of the most successful were the Ivy Awards that took place at the State Theater annually and gave recognition to what the Ivy evaluators, that group of people, considered to be moments of excellence that they wanted to lift up. The Ivy Awards were around for about 11 or 12 years, and I think they stopped about 4 or 5 years ago too, which leaves us with a little bit of a void because they really caught hold, and, you know, for better or for worse, I mean, awards, who knows, they seem to be embraced by the broader public and gave a chance for the theater community to come together and to do that. And it seems inappropriate right now, but I will mention that right behind me are my 2 Ivy Awards. Yay. Well, on that self-congratulatory note, Here's your court jester as a young man in the corner right there. And there I am a number of years later directing a production of The Miracle Worker for Torch Theater. We are now coming to the end of this program. I do like the statistics below on the importance of the arts to Minnesota citizens and how that's been supported, because it really does come back to that. There is so much theater and it is so rich and varied in so many ways, because people want to support it and want to come and see theater. If you want more information, just telling the deep story of theater in this area, there are two wonderful books that I included in some of the information and some of the comments that I've been giving. They've been invaluable to me. The Minnesota Theater by Frank Whiting, Doc Whiting from the University of Minnesota. And that's the longer, more in-depth historical kind of perspective. And that's the more current, contemporary, from about the last 10, 20 years or so, I would say, is Offstage Voices by Peg Guilfoyle. A wonderfully written book, and I recommend both of those. Thank you so much, if you made it this far, for listening to this program on theater in the Twin Cities. I'm Craig Johnson. I hope someday soon we'll all be able to get together live and in person at some of our many wonderful theaters here in the Twin Cities. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.